This presentation will explore processes and features of coastal erosion, which will be explored by the 5th year higher level group in the classroom. The reasons why I believe this topic is important are outlined on the slide shown here, a number of them being the fact that Ireland is an island, that coastal erosion is prevalent due to climate change, and that I believe it is important for people to be familiar with the landscape in their home country. All of the learning intentions are outlined here on this slide and will be discussed in greater detail throughout the presentation, including a discussion related to prior knowledge of students, the range of concepts and methodologies which will be used. I chose this topic to build upon my current level of knowledge and skills, as this has definitely been my weakest area of physical geography. Students would already be familiar with many of the processes of erosion. They would also be familiar with certain features of erosion, such as the cliff, especially if the teacher was to link this in with a local example. So maybe to show an image such as the ones outlined on this slide. They would also be very familiar with the weathering and erosion of rocks, and they would have an awareness of climate change and the impact which this has on rising sea levels and the force of the seas in coastal areas. I believe students may struggle to comprehend the concepts which are outlined on this slide, including compression and undercutting at the base of a cliff. However, there are a number of ways in which I could combat these issues, which will be explored in further detail in this presentation. I believe these concepts are more abstract than some of the other concepts which are explored in this topic, which is why I believe students would struggle to understand them at the beginning before they are explored in detail. The challenges which I foresee in teaching this topic would again be linked to challenges I believe students may have when studying the topic, so linked to maybe the concept of compression or the process of undercutting, again simply because they are more abstract terms. They do require further analysis and a more in-depth insight into the topic than some of the other concepts being explored. A teacher could use visual aids, video clips, diagrams and so on to aid understanding in difficult or complex terms. The diagram shown here is an example of how I would aid students in understanding compression. The teacher could draw these diagrams as the students watch, explaining each label in detail as it is drawn, allowing students to ask questions or ask for feedback as each diagram is drawn. Again, the diagram shown here could be used to explain the process of undercutting, as the teacher could draw the diagram and allow students to ask questions and explain each label in detail as it is drawn. However, the clip linked here could also be used to explain undercutting, as it will be a visual and oral manner to explain the process, which may suit some learners better. The key concepts to be explored are outlined on this slide and will all be explained in further detail throughout the presentation, including the two types of waves, the processes of erosion, and the discussion related to the formation and labelling of different features of erosion along the coast. The introductory lesson will be an important lesson to activate prior knowledge of the students, introduce them to key terms and concepts, and to build a foundation of knowledge before exploring formation of features in detail. At the beginning of the lesson, the teacher will show a YouTube clip related to climate change and rising sea levels to activate prior knowledge, as this topic would have already been explored. Students will be asked to know anything familiar or specific, and there will be a class discussion to ensure that students have a thorough understanding of this topic before moving on. The development of the lesson is outlined here on this slide. I believe that it is very important to introduce the topic when exploring waves and processes of erosion, as it is important for students to have a thorough understanding of the foundation of the information before exploring the features of erosion in detail. If students are to understand both of these concepts in detail, they will find it much easier to understand the formation of the features of erosion when they are explored in further detail in further lessons. So there will be different activity used, such as think, pair, share and the carousel activity, to ensure that all learners are being accommodated for in a range of styles, and students can support and assist one another and provide feedback for one another. The conclusion of the lesson will provide an opportunity for the teacher to assess students in a light-hearted and formative manner to ensure that students have a thorough understanding of the information which has been covered in this lesson before moving on. And this would be very important because the teacher would have to know that students have a thorough understanding of the foundations of the knowledge related to this topic before moving on to more complicated terminology. Students would then be expected to explore the formation of the features of erosion in detail. However, these will have to be covered in separate lessons, as there would not be enough time to cover everything in the introductory lesson, and these will be explained in further detail in the next slides. The first feature of erosion to be explored in detail would be the cliff. Students will be able to identify and explain each of the main steps involved in the formation of a cliff, so being able to explain compression, hydraulic action of the wave, etc. Also being able to explain the wave cut platform and the wave built terrace and their relation to the cliff. They will also be able to name an example of an Irish cliff and draw a diagram and label the diagram successfully when they're being assessed. The methodologies which will be used to teach about the formation of a cliff will now be explained. The clustering methodology is outlined here in detail on this slide. This methodology would encourage students to piece information together in the correct order to ensure they thoroughly understand the formation of the cliff. It also enables students to discuss different ideas and learn from one another as they explore each of the steps in detail and are allowed to provide constructive feedback for one another or ask questions before moving on. The 5 questions methodology would also be very useful in this case. An example of this methodology is outlined here on this slide, and it would be a good one to ensure that students of different learning styles and abilities are being catered for as you're using more than one methodology to teach about the topic. The clip linked here could be used as a visual or oral methodology to teach about the formation of a cliff to accommodate for the range of learning styles in the room. One example of assessment for this part of the topic could be to ask students to draw a diagram, label the diagram, and then explain each label in detail. Another form of assessment could be to use photographs and to ask students to label the photograph themselves and then explain each label again in detail to ensure that they can also identify labels on real-life examples of a cliff. Lesson 3 would then focus on the formation of the sea cave, the sea arch and the sea stack, which are all linked to one another. So students would have to be able to explain how each forms from the other. So an example, they would have to be able to explain how the sea cave is formed in the cliff from compression and an explosive effect. For the sea arch, they would have to be able to explain how the cave retreats to form an arch. For the sea stack, they would then have to be able to explain how this collapses to form a stack. They would also have to be able to name examples in Ireland and to draw labelled diagrams successfully explaining the diagrams. The methodologies which will be used to teach about these features of erosion will now be explained in detail. The consequence wheel would be an appropriate methodology to be used for this component of the topic, as the consequence wheel is all about making links, and so students could make links between the different features of erosion as they are all linked to one another and are formed from one another, and so students could portray to the teacher the knowledge they have related to each and their understanding of the links between each. The clip linked here could be used as a visual or oral methodology to explain the formation of the sea cave, the arch and the stack for those who prefer to learn in this manner. On this slide, we see an example of how the consequence wheel might look in a classroom. This methodology could also be used as a form of assessment because students would have to have a thorough understanding of the formation of each feature if they were actually to complete this task successfully. And so if they actually did complete the task successfully, the teacher would know that students have a thorough understanding. Another form of assessment could be to ask students to draw diagrams of each, labelling each diagram and then explaining the labels and diagrams to the teacher, being able to explain how one feature can lead to the formation of another, and students would also be expected to name examples of each in Ireland. Another form of assessment could be hot seating, as again this catering for different learning styles. However, the assessment is still light-hearted and formative, so the teacher can assess current level of understanding as different questions are being asked, and students can show their full level of comprehension when they are sitting in the hot seat or asking informed questions. Overall, at the end of the topic, students could be asked to create a poster in groups of 4 researching a process of erosion, as well as linking it back to make cross-curricular links and linking in with climate change and the effect that climate change has on this certain process of erosion. They would make posters, present their posters to the class, and there would be allocated time for peer assessment, questioning, feedback, etc. And the posters could be displayed in the classroom as a form of a visual aid to be a reminder to students of the topic and the different concepts within the topic.